Thank you guys for joining us here on Anderson Alerts. We've got a fun show here to talk about the North Carolina State Supreme Court race and perhaps more importantly, what happens next. So just wanted to give a few updates on where things stand, then we'll turn it over to our panel and take questions at the end for you guys to enter into the chat. Any questions you may have, feel free to do that at any point. So as things stand, the state Supreme Court race after 6 months and change is officially over. Democratic Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs won the race by 734 votes. Now, it's important to note that this isn't the end of this broader fight over election administration. Many of the concerns that Griffin had raised in his protests are still going to be issues to be talked about in the next couple years. We'll see how that plays out. And I wanted to bring attention to a few different stories that are pretty notable here that really talk about the state of things. The John Locke Foundation had a really valuable story that I think gets to the crux of this issue. You guys can check it out here. I also link to it on my Twitter page as well. But this sort of talks about, the election's over, but the fight is not as for what happens going forward. And I wanted to raise attention to this one specific part that's part of this John Locke analysis that's very important. It says that Myers, he's the U.S. District Court judge. He did not overturn the substantive findings in the state Supreme Court's ruling, just their retroactive application. Military and overseas voters must submit a voter ID in future elections, and never residents can only vote in federal elections. So the English average everyday translation for that means Griffin thumbs down for his claims for this election, but his claims going forward, those still need to be worked out by the State Board of Elections to prevent any future type of concerns and issues from happening going forward. And I talked to Justice Anita Earls, who was in the deliberation. She could not tell me what happened in the room. That would violate her judicial conduct, but she did give me some clarity on what the state Supreme Court order does and doesn't do. And effectively, there's now going to be two categories of voters. There's going to be voters that get federal only ballots, and there's going to be voters that have just the traditional ballots they've gotten throughout this process. And so, what has to happen next is the State Board of Elections has to comb through its databases and do some fact finding and try and sort out, which voters ought to only get federal only ballots. So people that voted are still going to be able to vote, but their voting power may be substantially diluted. And for 2026, that means you get the U.S. Senate race for some people, and you'd get the first congressional district for some people. And if you're not interested in the U.S. Senate race, and if you don't live in the first congressional district, that's kind of where your power starts and ends for some voters. But who fits into those categories? Why do they? Let's bring in our panel here to talk about it. We've got Chris Cooper, a Western Carolina University political scientist, and a new director role that we'll get into as well for Chris to talk about that. And we've got Mitch Kokai. He works for the conservative John Locke Foundation, has been doing a really, really good, important, nonpartisan work in bringing some attention to these issues that have come to light with the state Supreme Court race and talking about the legal filings. Chris, Mitch, thanks for joining. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, always like talking to both of you guys.
Yes. So I want to start with you, Chris. And, we had these protests filed by Griffin, and you had actually gone in depth to look at the different protest categories and who might be affected. Talk about what those protest categories were and who your data analyses found to be affected.
Yeah, it's great. So initially, it gets pretty confusing, right? But initially, he was challenging sort of multiple categories. Once he really went into the courts, a couple of those went away. So I think I sort of put them into three big buckets. So first, there were the people who had alleged incomplete information. These are people where the last four digits of their social security number or their driver's license number was not on file with the state board, at least upon first request. Now, the state board later filed some things that said, actually, we could find some of this. And the key thing to know, well, one of the key things to know here is these are people who registered after January 1st, I think it was 2004, right? So this is after HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, put these sort of requirements in to have this stuff recorded. So if you had incomplete information, you were registered to vote for the first time in 1996, your vote wasn't getting challenged at all, right? So that was one category of voters. Also, we need to be clear too, all along, he was only challenging people who did not vote on election day. These are people who voted early or absentee. A lot of reasons for that, but sort of at the most basic level, and the one that I think is the most important for folks to know, is that if you vote on election day, your ballot is not what we call retrievable. In other words, if I show up on election day, I cast my ballot, once it's in, they can never connect that to me, okay? If, however, I cast my vote early or by mail, there is a way to identify which ballot was Chris Cooper's ballot. So, for example, if I went and voted early in person, let's say Western Carolina University, where we have an early voting site, and I died before election day, the idea is you could then go in and say, okay, Chris, the former Chris, your vote doesn't count anymore because you weren't alive on election day, right? So it's not just the people who had incomplete information. It's incomplete information registered after a certain date, voted in person early, or voted mail. Confused yet? I hope so. So then we're not even to our other categories. Okay, then we have these categories of people he alleged are never residents. These are folks who checked a box on the when they went to get their ballot that said they had not been residents before. Now, whether they meant to do that, whether they checked the wrong box, there's really no way of knowing. And a lot of Brian's reporting obviously went and talked to some of those supposed never residents and figured out they kind of lived here a long time, maybe even their whole lives in some cases. But that was another sort of group of voters. Then UOCAVA, which is a federal law that says it's a uniform to military folks overseas, those people who cast a ballot in just certain counties. And this gets even more confusing, right? There's one interpretation that says he's only challenging one county, another interpretation, 4 counties, another interpretation, 6 counties. Put that aside for a second. The point is a limited number of counties of people who tended to, or who cast these UOCAVA ballots. And his logic here is he said, look, we have voter ID. It's a law of the land in the state of North Carolina. We passed it 6 ways to Sunday, and we did it by the legislature. We did it in terms of our own, a constitutional amendment. Everybody's approved this dang thing, and all these folks did not show their IDs, right? And one of the there are many responses. One was, why those counties? But another response was, hey, look, they weren't supposed to. The State Board of Election, if you went to their website, said you don't actually need to provide your ID here. Jefferson Griffin said you do. That's the law of the land. Ultimately, I think what the court kind of said was, well, this is a kind of a federal issue, so it's a little bit different. And this is where we get into this federal only ballot piece that Brian brought up. So
And
those are our big categories.
And I could guess people are very confused and following this as we are explaining it. It's a lot and it's a mess. The bottom line for folks is 3 protest categories.
Yep.
1 is people who never lived here.
Yep.
2 is people who are military overseas who didn't have to provide a photo ID at the time, but now are going to have to. And there's also incomplete registrations, quote unquote. This is the one that got the most eyeballs, but had been widely seen as the least compelling legal argument, the least likely to be successful. It's also the one that the state Supreme Court said, we're not going to be with you on that. We agree the State Board of Elections should have done better data management and vetting, but we're not going to go to the Griffin way of saying we need to retroactively cancel these votes. And I want to go to you, Mitch, because you've been following this very closely. And I think that sort of set the stage for how we got here. Talk about what happens next. In light of the state Supreme Court ruling, the Court of Appeals ruling, what does the average everyday North Carolina voter need to know for future elections?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see now what the State Board of Elections does going forward. We just had, as this case was resolved, the same time that Jefferson Griffin conceded the race was when the new State Board of Elections, with now a 3-2 Republican majority, as opposed to the old board's 3-2 Democratic majority, was seated. And my guess is the State Board of Elections, with its new constitution, is going to be looking at some of these things that Jefferson Griffin raised. And they will require different actions from the board That largest category of challenge voters, more than 60,000, was the people with incomplete voter registrations. To go back a little bit further in history, in late 2023,
That's an
some
eternity ago.
yeah, some right of center activists went to the old state board of elections and said, "Look, you have incomplete information here. You don't have the driver's license number or the last four digits of a social security number. You should go back and get that information." At the time, the state board of elections said, "You're right. We don't have the correct information. Going forward, we're going to ensure that we do." But they didn't go back and check what was at that time said to be 225,000 people with incomplete voter registration. And so that led to lawsuits. First, a lawsuit from the Republican Party before the election, and then Jefferson Griffin grabbed onto that issue as he was doing his election protest. My guess is there's going to be a push again, either internally within the new state board or from some of these conservative activists that pushed for this in the past to come back and say, okay, now fix this. Make sure that everyone who's in your voter registration list has this information. So there's that. Then there's the piece about the military and overseas voters who did not provide photo ID. And during the course of this legal argument, you heard from those defending the state board and on the side of Justice Riggs that, look, a lot of these people, they couldn't provide photo ID. They vote through a portal that doesn't allow that to happen. That's going to be something that will have to be addressed to ensure that they do comply with the state's voter ID law. Because even Justice Richard Dietz, who never voted alongside Jefferson Griffin on any of this, he was the only Republican on the state Supreme Court who right away said, I would reject this outright. He agreed with Griffin on both the voter ID issue and the never residence issue, that this needs to be addressed, that the voter ID law applies to everyone, and everyone means everyone, including overseas voters. So there's going to have to be something done to ensure that these people can provide a photo ID and their votes can be counted. And then the third category, the never residents, not only is there going to have to be something done to, as you alluded to earlier, provide potentially a North Carolina only ballot and a North Carolina only ballot or a federal only ballot or a federal and North Carolina ballot. You'd have to have those options, but also you would have to change a state law, because this was the one issue among those three categories where it wasn't just the state board of elections interpretation of a law that was challenged. This was actually a state law passed, if not unanimously, near unanimously, more than a decade ago, that said these people who have indicated they have never lived in North Carolina, but have a tie-in to North Carolina, largely through their parents. What was mainly contemplated here was adult children of North Carolina residents who had moved overseas, became adults after the family moved out of North Carolina. So they are citizens, they get to vote. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a state because they've never lived in a state. Although, as your reporting pointed out, some of the people who were targeted because they checked the box saying they lived in North Carolina, had never lived in North Carolina, actually had. But to address the never residents, not only would you have to come up with separate ballots, but you would have to go back and repeal or amend the law, because it was an actual state law that said these people could vote in the North Carolina election. So there's going to be a lot of work done at the state board of elections level. And my suspicion is, with the new constitution of the state board of elections, that there's going to be an interest in doing this. The old state board thought it had done everything right and fought this case in court, and it might have been dragging its heels a bit to deal with any of these issues. My guess is now the state board of elections will say, okay, Jefferson Griffin identified these issues, let's go ahead and address them.
Put well, and as succinctly as one could, given all of this complexity. I appreciate that, Mitch. I think you guys, since you both called out my story, I'll mention it. I'll pull it up here for folks to see and understand. This was one of the stories. What essentially happened was the state Supreme Court issues a ruling and essentially says, we take Griffin's word that these never residents are never residents, and we're going to kick them off the voter rolls or make their votes discarded. They won't count for this election, and there's no remedy So there's no ability for the State Board of Elections to give a cure period. There's no shot clock. For military overseas with no photo ID, you got a 15-day shot clock, then a 30-day shot clock. This group never got a shot clock. And that kind of caught me off guard, frankly, when the state Supreme Court did that. And so after that ruling, within hours, I had gone through this spreadsheet that I had gotten from the State Board of Elections. And it was a spreadsheet that had listed every single person in Griffin's protest category split by category. And I said, this never resident issue is now very much important. They can impact the outcome of the election. Also, they're the only group that now has no due process, if you will, under that order. And eventually, I had come down to a list of 30 people. And these are the names of the 30 people, as you can see, who who are clearly not never residents. And how did I reach that conclusion? 22 of them have a history of in-person voting. Eight of them through basic online searches. You can tell they were either born here, they either still live here, or they have lived here at some point and no longer do. So either way, these are 30 people over 1 in 10 who are clearly not never residents. And so what U.S. District Court Judge Richard Myers alluded to, he kind of alluded to this reporting in his order. And then what happened was now these never residents going forward, we have to see whether there's going to be some vetting to see what happens to these 30 people. But as for the people who are truly never residents, like Mitch said, presumably the next step is federal only ballot, and it has to be worked out either through some combination of the legislature, the State Board of Elections. So just since you guys talked about that, I wanted to highlight that. But going to the future here, the State Board of Elections is now a 3-2 conservative majority. Chris, how did it get this way? What happened?
Well, we had a bill that was initially going to be about regulating dentists. And then, as most bills that start with dental regulation, it ended up being one that was about Helene relief. And then, oh, yeah, by the way, it tacked on another 120 pages of, some people will call it shifts in power. Some people call it power grab. I'll let you pick your adjective. But the point is, it changed some stuff.
And that's Senate Bill 382 for folks. 132-page bill, 11 pages or so Helene, 121 non-Helene, and State Board of Elections was part of that non-Helene portion. Sorry, go ahead.
That's great. And so that obviously was very controversial, but one of the key pieces, was that it was going to take the power of appointment power over the Board of Elections. This again gets a little confusing, but since 1901, the party of the governor has gotten the majority of the seats on the state board. And it would change that, did change that, and it gave that power instead to the party of the state auditor. Now, we are the only state, we can argue it's good or bad, but the fact is we're the only state in the country that currently gives any of this power over elections to the state auditor. Maybe we figured out something nobody else has. Maybe it's a mistake. Folks can decide, but it is unique. And so that bill gave that power then to the state auditor. And I'm sure we'll play the ins and outs of this, but one thing I want to draw folks' attention to is this is sort of the first move of a two-move game. First, we get the state board. Then we're going to get all 100 county boards of election that are also going to change partisanship, right? So this isn't a change of one. This is a change of 101. It just happens to be that the one is the only one we've seen thus far.
Yeah, and then the 100 counties, I think, are mid-June, so that's forthcoming. Sure. Now, Mitch, it's not just the State Board of Elections itself. There's 5 members. You have NC Civitas former president, Francis DeLuca. He's out of the country. He couldn't join today. I tried to ask, but he had sort of told me, his goal as the new chairman is to kind of restore voter confidence in its processes, and there's going to be some discussion with the legislature of how best to do that. But the real power, I think, that people aren't really fully understanding or talking about is with someone named Sam Hayes. He's the general counsel to, I guess, as of today, he's no longer because he's with the State Board of Elections as of today, but he's been the general counsel for McCrory administration, Department of Environmental Quality, then Treasurer Falwell, then House Speaker Tim Moore, then House Speaker Destin Hall. And he is someone who also ran for Attorney General. He is now the executive director. He has the ability to hire, fire, carry out the day-to-day operations. And I've just heard a lot of people talking about Auditor Bolick. I've heard a lot of people talking about Chairman DeLuca. Talk to me, Mitch, about why the executive director, Sam Hayes, matters and what his job becomes.
Well, this is where you have boots on the ground. The State Board of Elections sets policy, presumably based on the elections law that's set in North Carolina, but it's the executive director who has to carry things out. And the previous executive director, Karen Brinson Bell, who the new state board replaced in its very first meeting, she had drawn fire from some within the General Assembly and from some Republican activists for some of the steps she had taken, especially during the 2020 election year, when, of course, we were dealing with COVID and there were all kinds of requests for changing the way election rules should operate. Karen Brinson Bell went to the General Assembly, asked for some changes that would relax some voting restrictions. The General Assembly said no. Then a lawsuit was filed. The plaintiffs in that suit worked with the law firm of Mark Elias, who, if that name is not familiar to people, he is a
He's the
longtime
GOP's best
Democratic.
friend, right?
Yeah, he was a longtime Democratic operative. He is the man behind the so-called Steele dossier, for those who have followed all of that from Donald Trump's past. So Mark Elias's client sued, and the State Board of Elections, with Karen Brinson Bell, decided to settle the suit with Elias rather than fighting it. The General Assembly, the Republicans within the General Assembly and other conservative activists got angry, saying this is a sue and settle scheme so that the
Collusive
Board of Elections.
settlement, right? That was the term for
Right,
that.
sue and settle. It's something that's been well known for years. It's a tactic that environmental groups have used with friendly environmental regulators for years and years. But it's something that Karen Brinson Bell got knocked for, and so it's no surprise that a new Republican majority board was going to replace her as the executive director. It was the same thing done the last time the Democrats took over the board. Kim Strzok, who had been a person who had worked for the State Board of Elections under both Democratic and Republican leadership, but she had been the head of the board's executive staff under the Republican administration. Plus, her husband is a major Republican lawyer working on redistricting cases and other election law cases. So it was no shock when the Democrats let her go. Also, no shock when the Republicans let Karen Brinson Bell go. But now Sam Hayes is going to be the one who's really going to be in charge of carrying out the policy set by the state board, guided by the state law. And as you alluded to from your conversation with Francis DeLuca, the idea from the perspective of those now coming on the board is to ensure that the elections are conducted by the law without any changes within the rules and numbered memos that go against the spirit of the law. I'm sure that the State Board of Elections will take some actions that will raise the ire and raise some red flags for Democrats, because they'll say, oh, these are moves that are suppressing votes or that are disqualifying people who should be able to vote. From the other side of the argument, the Republicans will say, we're going to follow the law. And if the law says you can vote, you can. If the law says you can't vote, you can't. And I'm sure that'll generate plenty of headlines over the next few years.
And I want to open it up to questions. If anybody has any, please put them in the chat. I had one more for Chris and Mitch, the same question to you. You know, Democrats are very celebratory with their Riggs win, but as we have talked about, there's a lot of forthcoming changes to election oversight, administration, implementation of these court orders coming out. Uh, Mitch, did Democrats win the battle but lose the war here?
It remains to be seen. They certainly won the battle, and I think that was the outcome that most everyone expected. Other than Jefferson Griffin's closest supporters, I'm not sure there was anyone who really thought he was going to overturn the election result. In fact, we've alluded to Chief District Judge Richard Myers, and mainly what came out of his opinion and order was, it's just too long after the election to be messing with these rules now. The rules that were in place at the time said that Allison Riggs won by 734 votes. She wins, go ahead and certify her. But that win in place, the State Board of Elections, moving now under the control of the state auditor, Dave Bullock, is an opportunity for some substantial changes potentially in election rules and administration.
Chris, did Democrats win the battle but lose the war here?
I don't know who wins the war. I think I think as Mitch said pretty well. I mean, this said very well. This is the outcome we thought we were going to get. And I would, yeah, I mean, look, let's get back in the partisan lens for a second. But I think it through another lens, like, I mean, this was clear. We had a Trump appointed judge who nobody thought was going to be particularly friendly to the left, putting down this ruling. So, I mean, I think we should be able to say this was ultimately ruling in the best interest of the state and the best interest of these voters, right? In terms of who's going to win this sort of partisan battle, I mean, the state board of elections is a very different thing, right? And I mean, there is no doubt that the Republicans were able to replace Karen Brinson Bell with somebody they like better. They went from a democratically controlled board to a Republican controlled board. That's going to be better for the Republican Party and the kinds of outcomes policy wise that they want. One of the questions I'm still unclear on is what's going to happen 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, 16 years. I don't know the number, but at some point, the governor is going to be a Republican and the auditor is going to be a Democrat. And it may very well be that the Republicans are still in control of the General Assembly. And so the war is going to continue. I don't know that anybody's going to win this war. I don't think this is the last move that we've seen like either one of these, the court battle or this battle over the State Board of Elections.
We got
And
a
Brian,
question.
I think one more thing we ought to add really quickly is
Yeah.
that another thing that's moving through the courts that is really going to make a major difference is how the state courts deal with various lawsuits over the General Assembly shifting power away from the governor to other members of the executive branch. You've got it with the auditor and the State Board of Elections. You also have it with an appointment on the State Utilities Commission going from the governor to the treasurer. And there are a number of other boards where the General Assembly has taken power that had been in the hands of the governor and given it to other members of the executive branch, specifically ones who are Republicans. Several court cases in the works. If the state courts say that the General Assembly can do that and these hold up, then I think that you could see a lot of ways in which other members of the Council of State that the General Assembly happens to like will get some powers that had been held by the governor for years and years.
See, this is why we like to have Mitch on. I was about to ask Michelle's question. He just answered it before we got there. That's what it is. There's a number of lawsuits. She asked, are there any lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the state legislature taking appointments from the governor? Yeah, there's a number of lawsuits, some of which you just highlighted there. There's a question from Martin. He asks, Never residents, would they be required to show photo ID if using a federal postcard application or write-in ballot? I'm guessing the answer is we don't know yet. Is that fair to say? We have to see what the State Board of Elections does.
I would think it would be we don't know, but I would lean toward yes, only because the court rulings that have come out have said there's a photo ID law. It applies to everyone, and so everyone means everyone, and they meant everyone, even when talking about the overseas and military voters who did not have a way to provide photo ID because they vote through a portal where that's not an option. So my guess is, unless there's some guidance otherwise, that these never residents who would only be able moving forward to vote in a federal election would probably have to also show photo ID because the photo ID law applies, as the courts have said, to everyone.
And just final question for both of you. Chris, this has been a more than 6 month long case. What do you think, to the extent possible, things have been overlooked or not understood by the public because it's a complicated case? What is your big takeaway that you think is flying under the radar right
That's great. That's a great question. I mean, there's so much, and it's not that I don't think journalists have done a good job covering it. This is, as we have demonstrated, I think, a really complicated issue. And so I think perhaps this sort of bigger question about whether state laws apply to federal elections, right? So, I mean, this piece that Mitch has talked about very well about what might happen, what might not happen with the voter ID piece, whether you have to show it. I think like reminding folks that it's possible we're going to have different systems essentially voting for different kinds of offices is maybe flying a hair under the radar screen. And I think in general, just the overarching system of elections, right? There's a sense oftentimes that the federal government's the one doing stuff. And I think if nothing else, this should remind people that elections are by and large administered at the state level. And whether it's a good or bad thing's a conversation for a different day. And then the other shoe that's about to drop that I think has been undercovered is all these changeovers in the Board of Elections. And everybody's going to concentrate in about 1 month about the partisan changes. But let's remember, they also may have changes within those partisans. Okay. So, in other words, so I live in Jackson County. We had two Republicans on the board. From everything I'm hearing, the Republicans who are going to be on the board going forward, two different Republicans. So I think we need to keep track of who these people are, not just what the party label is. Yes, that's important, but there's more to it than that.
Mitch, what's flown under the radar to you from this whole process?
I'm not sure that it's flown under the radar, but we haven't talked a lot about it, and that is the future of the state Supreme Court. One thing that's very interesting is that now that this case is resolved, the state Supreme Court looks exactly the way it did before this controversy. Five Republicans, two Democrats, all seven of them the same people as we had going into the election.
Wait,
And the next
you're telling me we've talked about something for the last 6 months and nothing's changed?
nothing has
This was
changed.
all
In
just a
effect,
big waste of time for reporters and analysts? No.
well, it certainly hasn't been a waste of time. But remember also, as this whole thing was going on, Allison Riggs continued to serve on the state Supreme Court. So there wasn't even an empty seat. Things had progressed as they moved forward. But remember that if there's going to be some sort of blowback about what Jefferson Griffin did here, and I think there's a potential for that, I'm not sure how it ends up playing out with the state Supreme Court because the next time around, there's only one seat up for grabs, and it's fellow Democrat Anita Earls. So it's not as if voters angry at Republicans are going to take it out on Republican state Supreme Court justices in 2026. They don't have a chance to. There's only one person up, and she's a Democrat. Their first opportunity to try to knock out Republican justices will be in 2028. Will the general voting populace remember much about this by then? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think for me, just where I'd like to end is, we've talked about numbers, we've talked about data, we talked about processes, we talked about elections officials. The biggest thing I think people don't understand or have missed in this process is there are actual people behind these data cells, behind these spreadsheets, behind these protest categories. And I think the biggest thing I'd want to impart is if there's Democrats, Republicans, reporters, the thing everyone can agree on is you want to make sure that legitimate votes count. And the bottom line for me and my reporting right now has shown there are legitimate voters who may have checked a wrong box on a form. And there are people who right now stand to possibly have their votes diluted to only federal races, even though they've lived here a while. There has to be some vetting process for these wrongly accused never residents. We have to see how that plays out. But there are people who are Republicans who went to Liberty University, a D1 swimmer. There's a Democrat who has taught at university levels. There are tons of people affected. This isn't just a partisan issue, and there are some serious questions going forward. But at the end of the day, there are people behind these stories, people behind what we're talking about and these policies that are being impacted. So I hope folks will keep that in mind as we continue covering this. But Mitch, Chris, thank you guys so much for the time, the insights. We appreciate it. And for folks on here, a recording will be available afterwards. So just refresh the Anderson Alerts page. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You.